That's great. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Ponte. She's going to be giving us her exit seminar. Sarah has been with us for the last 4 years and has been doing some really exciting work at the forefront of urban ecosystem ecology. And as you'll see, she'll be talking about different aspects of that work, both from an ecophysiological perspective and also from a social ecological perspective. Sarah has racked up a whole bunch of different awards and fellowships. I had to write them down so I don't forget any. Just to show you how awesome she is and all the great work that she's been doing. She has been an urban forestry fellow with the Maryland Forestry Foundation. She was a global steward fellow with the Global Stewards program here on campus. She was an Ecological Society of America Earth Stewardship fellow, which had a strong outreach and community engagement side to it. She has one paper already published from her dissertation in Scientific Reports that got a lot of press, and she'll be talking about some of those results today. Because of all this great work, she was awarded the Outstanding Graduate Assistant Award by the grad school in 2022. And this fall, she's going to be working on a Wiley dissertation fellowship as she finishes up writing her dissertation. So with that, I'll let Sarah tell you about her work.
I'll just mention I'm going to put the evaluation link in the chat box, and it will also be coming in your email at about 12:30 today. So great.
Thank you much for the really nice introduction. Thank you everybody for joining. So I'll talk a little bit about my dissertation research on socio-ecological processes and dynamics of urban forests in Maryland. So first, I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, and my committee members, our ecology lab group, collaborators from the Forest Service, and all those organizations that helped with finding access to field site data and any research support that made this research project possible. So a quick outline, I'll be presenting today some overall background, intro, and then the 3 main chapters of my dissertation, and finally finishing with some overarching conclusions. So first, some quick background. As we know, urbanization with increasing roads, impervious surfaces, it causes runoff to go to our water systems, and this stormwater runoff carries pollutants, nutrients, and sediments that impair our waterways. And in order to remediate that in urban areas, some gray infrastructure can be replaced with green infrastructure. And urban trees are also an effective tool for stormwater management through their ecohydrological processes, evapotranspiration, interception. They use and lose water. And with their tree roots, they also promote water infiltration in the soil and promote storage of water in the soil, as well as through transpiration. They lose the transport waters from the soil to the atmosphere. So we know those processes well, but we don't fully understand the extent of how much trees contribute to stormwater management. And so part of my research aims to evaluate this. So with urbanization, there is a big threat in the Chesapeake Bay for stormwater runoff. And according to data from the Chesapeake Bay program in 2015, there's about 17% of nitrogen pollution in the bay comes from urban and suburban stormwater runoff. And thinking of that environmental challenge and also trying to tie this to urban trees, the Chesapeake Bay program convened an expert panel in 2015 in order to better understand and quantify the role of trees to mitigating stormwater runoff and pollutants into the bay. And this was part of the phase 6 of the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. And their main findings was that there is a need for research, field research or GIS-based analysis on the quality and quantity benefits of urban trees on stormwater management. And on the map on the right of Baltimore City, you can see the green spaces in Baltimore. And according to the expert panel in the Chesapeake Bay area, there's about 17% of tree canopy in developed land use. And this is not taking into consideration forest patches, for example. So that shows a great potential of integrating and managing urban trees for stormwater management in urban areas. And due to this lack of performance data of trees in the stormwater infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, there is a lack of research, inadequate research that promotes the use of trees by stormwater managers. So we don't know how to quantify those benefits. And a lot of times, county or city governments remove those trees to install other green infrastructure practices, sometimes because of maintenance and management costs. And so socio-ecological systems, also called human and nature, coupled human nature systems, they have all these components, socio-ecological components that have feedback and interactions that we need to better understand to fully understand the whole picture of those interactions. And for the first 2 chapters of my dissertation, I'll be focusing on those ecological components such as trees, soil, microclimate, and water cycling, and its integration to the social components as management practices. So urban trees are socio-ecological systems with many players playing a role in managing them based on where those trees are. And in the rural to urban system, there's a wide range of management gradients that varies from highly unmanaged, so trees in vacant lots, for example, down the bottom right, to forest patches, to highly managed street trees. And my first 2 chapters will focus on this gradient of forest patches and street trees. So the first chapter, as Mitch mentioned, is I'll show some findings from our publication related to transpiration rates of red maples across management contexts in Maryland. So the main questions of this project was to evaluate if transpiration rates of trees of same species, red maple, vary among different management contexts, and does the relationship between environmental drivers and transpiration change among those contexts. So by management context here, we mean 3 different management scenarios that we had monitored tree transpiration. So in Baltimore City, we monitored trees in a closed canopy or forest patch. That was in Maryland School for the Blind campus. And we also monitored trees in single trees over turf grass and cluster of trees over turf grass in Gaithersburg, Maryland, Montgomery County. And these are some pictures of our site. So on the left, the single trees, the middle picture is a cluster of trees, and on the further right, the forest patch with understory. And to monitor microclimate drivers of transpiration, we had weather stations on both field sites, so one in each site out in the open, and they measured temperature, precipitation, and humidity. And we also monitor soil moisture at a depth of 30 centimeters, and they were placed at the drip line of each tree that was also monitored for subflux. So subflux here was used as a proxy for transpiration rates. and they were measured with Grenier type thermal dissipation subflux sensors. Were designed by Grenier in around 1985, and they were built at the UMD Project Development Center. And here's a picture of our closed canopy site with the sensors under this aluminum shield to protect from solar radiation. And the schematics of what those sensors look like. So installed in the sapwood of the tree, so the xylem of the living cells that are responsible for transporting water. We installed the heated and the reference probes, and they basically measure the differential voltage that then we can estimate how much water is moving through the sapwood and use as a proxy for transpiration. And those sensors are connected to a data logger that that stores in the average half an hour for those measurements, as well as the soil moisture measurements, and they have 12-volt batteries for power. So there's a zoomed in picture of the sensors in the sapwood of the tree, and here Robert is replacing the batteries attached to the data logger. So we're showing some results here. So here you're seeing a time series of sap flux, and so sap flux density, so in grams of water per centimeter square of the sapwood per day. And these are the 24-hour sum of sap flux, so counting the daytime and nighttime flux. And this, you can see the trend for the year of 2018 for the single trees, the cluster, and the closed canopy side trees. So the single trees had tended to have a greater mean daily sum of sap flux. And in this box plot, we did a repeated measure of ANOVA to see which management contexts were different. So single and cluster trees in the single and cluster sites were significantly different than the closed canopy. And the single red maple trees had about 3 times the daily sum of sap flux density of closed canopy trees. And it's important to note this is the rate. So per square centimeter of the tree, and not taking into consideration the size or the diameter of the tree. And we also are interested into the relationship between sap flux and vapor pressure deficit, which is the difference between moisture in the air and that saturation point. So higher VPG means it's hotter and drier. And VPG is a strong driver of sap flux. So we split our data into 7 week time periods. So on the top figure is the early summer, the middle is late summer, and then fall on the bottom. And we saw that the single tree site was more responsive to VPG. Maybe because they were less buffered from microclimate response, and also there were seasonal differences. So as in the mid-late summer, they were more responsive to VPD when compared to early summer. And the trees in the single and cluster site had a greater variability in sap flux when compared to the closed canopy. So the main take-home messages from this is that we saw the isolated trees had an increased transpiration over those in a closed canopy site due to this leading edge effect. They're being less buffered from climate stress, and the relationship between sap flux and vapor pressure deficit was different across those contexts and varies across the seasons. But there's still a need to have a whole tree transpiration to understand the forest standing structure. So this knowledge can be used for stormwater management. And that's how my next chapter is gonna build on. which is using evaluating transpiration rates and whole tree water used by different deciduous species. So here the same, we have the same sites than the previous one, but we have the data for 3 species. So red maple is in all the tree management context, and then we have sweet gum in the cluster and closed canopy. And in the closed canopy site, we also have tulip poplar trees monitored. So the main goal of this study was to determine the role of urban trees in stormwater management and to inform the use of trees to meet stormwater management requirements. So the main questions here was if transpiration rates and whole tree transpiration vary across management contexts, and are there any species-specific differences? And if this relationship between the environmental drives and transpiration change across those different tree species. So we have data for 2018-2019 growing season that we combined, and on the left graph, you can see the subflux density for all the tree species across the management context. And as we saw in the first chapter, the trees in the single site were significantly different than the closed canopy, but we didn't see any differences across species, the sweet gum, red maple, and tulip poplar. And then we also, using a published model, we extrapolated this, the subflux density to the whole tree water use based on the diameter of the tree. And then on the right graph, that's what it's shown, the liters of water per day per tree, and in each management context and species. And we didn't see, when we extrapolated these values, we didn't see any differences across the species or the management context. And it's important to note that the tulip poplar trees, the green box plots, those, they are like almost twice the size in diameter than the red maple and sweet gum trees. So it kind of compensated that any differences. So moving from like looking at the broader picture, the whole growing season, we looked at 3 example days in 2019. So on the left are plots from May 5th, which is early growing season day under like in a rainy day. And in the middle graph says in July 19, which was a mid-growing season that had rained a couple days before. And then on August 30th, on the farther right, you can see those graphs are from a drought period late in the growing season. So the main take homes from these graphs is that looking at figures E and F on the bottom. So under drought conditions and with higher soil moisture, you can see the tulip poplar, which is the green line, and it reduced about by 60% in the total subflux density, and the red maple reduced 29%, and sweet gum by 16%. So tulip poplar was more sensitive to the drought when compared to the other species in the closed canopy site. And we also looking at the same days, but for the red maples in the 3 management context that we have. And in the drought period, the single trees had a higher total subflux when compared to the other trees, but in under non-drought conditions, the red maples in the closed canopy had a higher total subflux density. And we also looked at the relationship again between subflux and vapor pressure deficit and the closed canopy, but we split the data in limiting, non-limiting soil moisture conditions, meaning limiting soil moisture below 20%, and non-limiting higher than 20%. And this is based on literature that has suggested that at a soil moisture concentration than less than 20%, there is a higher control of stomatal conductance. So they're sensitive to these conditions. So we basically, like we saw in those other graphs, that tulip poplar was more sensitive to the red maple and sweet gum species. And using our subflux data, as well as like this was based on subflux data in the peak of growing season, July 2018. And basing on the size of we use different size of trees to estimate the total whole tree water use. So that could be a useful tool for stormwater managers to see, okay, based on this species, in this management context, that's how much we think that tree is gonna probably transpire through a day. So for example, a tree with 60 centimeters diameter, close canopy, tulip poplar, sweet gum might move almost 100 liters per day, but a single tree, a red maple tree, it will move around almost 250 liters per day. So just to have a useful tool for managers that can estimate those numbers. And for the next step of this research, so we plan to scale up the subflux measurements to the plot level. So you can see the figures on the left, the closed canopy site, and the single trees and cluster site. The closed canopy, of course, has a higher density, stand density, when compared to the cluster site. So we're gonna go out there and do plot surveys, about 20 meters by 20 meters plot, and see how many trees are there, and identify the species and measure the DBH. So we can do a water budget exercise. We have data on precipitation, have data on transpiration. So how much percent runoff reductions those trees might help mitigate. So moving on to the third chapter of my dissertation on spatial distribution of environmental stewardship and implications for stormwater management and tree canopy cover in Baltimore. So this project is moving on from mainly ecological, but now focusing on social and its interaction with the ecological as stewardship and resource management, to tie all this socio-ecological system. So cities are complex socio-ecological systems, and we're focusing on three parts of it: stewardship, green stormwater infrastructure, and tree canopy. So in the left figure, you can see the stewardship mapping in Baltimore that was done by the Forest Service. And those map who was taking care for the environment, which organizations, local community groups that are working towards managing their local environment. And also in Baltimore, due to like some permits, stormwater permits, they have to do replace or retrofit green infrastructure with green stormwater infrastructure. And as we talked about before, the tree canopy is part of this green stormwater infrastructure. So for the stewardship part of it, the U.S. Forest Service has done surveys across multiple cities, New York City, Baltimore, Seattle, to map who is taking care of the environment, and they've mapped where the office locations of those organizations, as well as polygons of where the action is happening, as well as the network. So who are those organizations collaborating with? And for Baltimore, they also have data for 2011 and 2019. So they have sometimes multiple data sets for each city. And stewardship is strong connections and support for communities to help them recover and also extend those benefits to future generations, as well as create resilient communities. And a lot of those stewardship organizations are focused on implementing green stormwater infrastructure and improving and maintaining tree canopy cover. And the incorporation of those voices into GSI installation or tree canopy conservancy provides community empowerment. And some of those pictures are from Baltimore Green Space, which is a nonprofit in Baltimore that is one of their main goals is to support underserved communities. And they have a lot of environmental missions to their organization. And so talking a little bit about literature review. So previous literature has showed that there is relationships between green stormwater infrastructure and social demographics and green space and previous surface coverage. But those relationships may change based on the level of the scale of analysis, like if it's a census block group, census tract, or neighborhood. So for this project, we are focusing on the neighborhood level in Baltimore across its 278 neighborhoods. So we know Baltimore is a highly heterogeneous city, as all of them. Like this figure, you can just see Wakefield neighborhood has about 68% tree canopy, and Madison East End about 6% tree canopy. So this just shows the heterogeneity of cities, and also like who that has implications for environmental justice. So who has access to those to this tree? So who is benefiting from it? This is gonna vary across ranges of social demographic characteristics. In a previous literature that has investigated in Seattle and Baltimore, the relationship between stewardship and tree canopy, they saw an increase in tree canopy with the addition of stewardship organization. So the main research questions for this project is to identify feedbacks or patterns of correlations between stewardship, tree canopy cover, and green stormwater infrastructure, as well as relationships to social demographics and between tree canopy cover and green stormwater infrastructure. So we can identify and potentially identify environmental justice patterns. And we got data from a variety of sources. So environmental stewardship data was collected from surveys done by the Forest Service in 2011 and 2019. And green stormwater infrastructure was gathered by the city of Baltimore, and that is a regulatory GSI, so it's managed by the city to meet their stormwater management requirements. And there is also a data set from UC Davis for voluntary GSI, which is mainly managed by community organization to achieve their own missions, not necessarily related to the city requirements. And we also have land use cover data, specifically focused on tree canopy cover that was gathered by the Chesapeake Conservancy from 2018, and also change of tree canopy cover from 2013 and 18, and social demographics like median household income, race and ethnicity characteristics of each neighborhood. And some of my questions were related to the spatial distribution of environmental stewardship groups predict green stormwater infrastructure locations in Baltimore. So we did some, these are some initial, these are not the final results, but some initial exploratory graphs of this relationship. So we plotted on the x-axis, it's the number of stewardship organizations working with trees and GSI. So these organizations have a wide focus. So we filtered for those specifically working with trees and GSI in 2019 and 2011. And trying to find correlations with voluntary GSI. When we found for the 2011 data, we found a positive relationship between those variables. And we also asked how are social demographic characteristics associated with tree canopy cover change, and number of GSI. So on the x-axis, it's and one of the social demographic characteristics as median household income. And we saw a positive relationship between percent tree canopy cover or percent tree canopy cover over impervious with median household income, which is similar to findings from previous literature. So wealthier neighborhoods have a higher percent of tree canopy. And also we looked into percent Hispanic and Latino population. We saw a negative relationship between this population and percent tree canopy cover. And we also looked into the relationship between percent tree canopy cover over impervious surfaces and regulatory and voluntary GSI, and we saw a negative relationship between regulatory GSI and percent tree canopy cover, meaning there is less tree canopy over impervious, there was higher regulatory GSI, and the same pattern was not found for the voluntary types. So to finalize with some overarching conclusions from all those chapters, we saw that management context does have an impact on urban tree function. So depending where a tree is located, it's gonna have various eco-hydrological functions. And those findings are helpful to plan for and better understand how planting density around certain species, deciduous tree species, affect tree water use through transpiration, and help us better understand how trees are responding to current and will respond to future climate to affect resilience regarding climate stress. And we also found that spatial patterns in these feedback connections vary between those biophysical and social factors, and that can point out to environmental justice concerns. Oh, and I forgot to mention for the last chapter, we saw a lot of neighborhoods that had zero stewardship or zero green stormwater infrastructure. So to deal with this skewed data, we are converting the data from count to binary form, presence or absence, and we'll do a logistic regression model to assess those differences. So thank you everybody for listening, and thank you for everybody that has been a part of my journey, all my friends, advisor, committee members that are very supportive. My mom, I brought my mom to the field site on the bottom right before pandemic. So yeah, thank you again for listening.
So you said that single trees have higher rates of transpiration, but you kind of hinted that having an overall larger number of trees, even if they all have lower rates, could kind of equal or counteract that? Like, what would your recommendations be then for incorporating trees into green stormwater infrastructure?
So you mean like a tree in the single site on the closed canopy site?
Yeah, like what would you, even though it's got higher rates, is that outdone by the sheer number of trees in the closed canopy in terms of what would be better for combating like flooding or?
So yeah, it is higher rate per area of the sapwood. So that's gonna be different depending on the size. So more mature trees are gonna have a larger diameter. So they're gonna have a overall higher whole tree transpiration. And of course, if we have more trees, higher density in the forest stand is gonna have an overall higher transpiration than single trees spaced out over a lawn by a street. And also those trees are highly stressed and less buffered from climate, so that may influence their mortality down the road.
So my question was sort of related to this last question too. So I'm just thinking strategically, right? I mean, we might say that there's much greater ET from a closed canopy, but in terms of sort of the investment required to attain that, I mean, what it sounded to me like that there was a lot of benefit from sort of, proceeding with sort of planting single trees or trees that are spaced, that they're going to have a lot of impact, especially as they grow. And you sort of get more bang per tree. So that in an urban setting, it seems like, single trees or spaced trees is still a very useful, viable approach. Would you comment on that, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, if you don't have the space for like a forest stand, so you might as well, this research shows there is value on isolated trees. And besides conserving forest patches, you can still increase, and like when I mentioned some counties, they remove trees for stormwater infrastructure, which is not an effective tool. So keeping those, allocating costs for maintaining and increasing street tree canopy cover is an effective tool for stormwater management. Even though those trees might not be big enough as the forest patch, they still have their value and their contribution to even looking at the water local or going to the watershed scale.
Questions for Sarah? So
I had a question. I posted it on the chat box. So I was just wondering if you had any anecdotal evidence about the perspectives that disadvantaged populations within the communities have about trees and tree canopies, specifically in their urban environments.
Sorry, what was the question?
Can you ask that again, Dave?
Yeah. Did you uncover any evidence about the perspectives that disadvantaged populations have about trees and tree canopies?
So like the community perspective, the point of view on tree canopy, like survey?
Yes.
No, we don't have any surveys that we performed. We are using the data from the surveys from the Forest Service, but it's mainly on what groups are there, where their focus, are they focused on stormwater trees, education, or removal of invasive trees? It's more on the organization level rather than individuals' perspectives on their local or tree canopy cover.
Yeah, I think I've just seen previous studies and some anecdotal evidence that certain populations look at tree canopy as gentrification, as the opening to gentrification, and basically, taking over their neighborhoods. So they're not looked upon favorably from that perspective. So I don't know if you gained any knowledge about that specifically.
In one, like the Earth Stewardship Initiative Fellowship that we and a few other students in this program were involved, we went to a community group meeting, and Their main concern there was they have to pay out of their own pockets to maintain trees that were like on their sidewalk or in their property or going into their property from the public right of way. And that the cities were not properly maintaining those. So their main concern was that they couldn't afford maintaining those trees and they're not getting funding resources from their local government. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
That's good. Thank you. I think Jennifer has, Dr. Mullinex has a follow-up question.
Oh, hi, Jennifer.
Oh, Jennifer doesn't have a microphone, so I'll read her comment for everyone. She says, in the gentrification vein, beyond street trees, are there programs to renaturalize small sites like dilapidated buildings, creating pocket parks or community gardens within some of the highly dense city areas?
Yeah, I don't know about Baltimore in specific. I don't have any examples on the top of my head, but I know there are pop-up parks projects that I've seen in other cities and examples in other conferences that I've seen some presentations about those, but I don't have any examples specifically in Baltimore.
Matt?
I can just add to that, just try in Baltimore, they have an adopt a lot program where community groups or community organizations have to adopt available lots in the city. And then they can do with what they want on that property until, but one of the major downfalls that in the interviews that I've conducted with that is, and once the city then wants the land back, they can just take it back whenever they want. So a lot of community organizations would build gardens or little public parks on these adopt a lot properties, and then the city would come in and say, hey, actually, we want to sell that property, or kick you off, we're going to sell it to whatever industry, whatever apartment group, whatever we want. So there's a lot of disconnect between, it's a good start, obviously, but there's a lot of disconnect between how that land is actually used, and then who actually benefits from it that long down the road. So a host of issues that are brought up to be really complex urban areas. So.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I had a second technical question.
Go ahead, Dave.
I posted it in the chat box, but I'll repeat it. Did you get any gain any knowledge about the through flow, I'm sorry, or the canopy storage of water when you were studying the trees? There's evidence shows that urban canopies are probably reducing storm flow by up to 25% when you have a dense canopy. That's the knowledge that I have. And it's mostly due to that capturing in the canopy storage and reduced through flow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did have rain gauges installed in each site under the canopy, but we're not using that data, especially because we had only one rain gauge under the tree canopy, and the leaf area is complex to just look at one. So I saw some studies that looked at it, but they had multiple rain gauges and to measure interception. But so we had some data, but we're not using that because it's not enough for it to measure through fall and interception.
Yes, I have a quick question. This is a really basic question. So I'm not familiar with, this thermal dispersion technique that you use. And I was just wondering if you could explain, just kind of technically how it works. Because there's two electrodes, there was a reference and then one, and I'm trying to imagine how it works. And I'm just wondering if the main electrode heats up to a certain temperature and then you're just measuring the dissipation of heat.
Yeah, I'm also not deep onto the, but yeah, basically it's just the heated probe and the reference probe, and the heated is, they're both attached to the data log and the power supply, but this heated, it's heated by the power supply, and then we can get the differential voltage between those probes. And then there is an equation that it's a standard equation used in this with these sensors that we can convert to water, how much water is passing through. So that's what I use for as a proxy for
All
transpiration.
right, cool. Yeah, because that was my question, is if there is like a voltage being read or if it was.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much, Sarah. Let's give Sarah one more. Thank you. Let me remind everyone to complete your online evaluation, which is either in the chat box or if you're on